Protectionism and Free Trade. Frederick Engels. Presentation. A capitalist society is made up mainly of big capitalists, small capitalists, and workers, both in the city and in the countryside. Big capital is the one that advances society as a whole through the invention, innovation, organization of thousands, millions of workers in industries, also by lowering the price of commodities of all kinds and increasing their quality. Big capital, in its different branches, mainly industrial capital, is the locomotive of a society. To identify the capitalist system only with big capital is to leave aside the petty bourgeoisie, which is the one that employs workers the most, and also employs them in worse working conditions and with miserable wages as well as without labor benefits. For example, in Mexico, it is the petty bourgeoisie that exploits the largest number of workers in terrible conditions. Big capital is not the cause of the most terrible working conditions in a country, but on the contrary, the lack of large capital, of large investments is what creates the so-called poverty, or relative poverty. To identify the exploiters only with big capital is to hide from the petty bourgeoisie, which is miserable because of its lack of development. Identifying capitalism only with big capital leads to supporting the petty bourgeois. Those who blame big capital, for example, Bimbo, Gamesa, Oxxo, Grupo Monterrey. Their rage is so great that they have even kidnapped and murdered representatives of the big bourgeoisie. If there is no development in a region, it is due to lack of capital, especially investment of large capitals. Anyone with common sense knows that, except the Marxists, who call themselves followers of Karl Marx, distort everything and make him appear as an enemy of big capital, liberalism, neoliberalism, other times they call it monopoly capital or imperialism, ultra-imperialism, being that precisely the sector of society is the civilizing sector of the entire society. The civilizing aspect of big capital or neoliberalism is exposed hundreds of times in the works of Karl Marx. That is why we put to consideration this very important prologue written by Frederick Engels, Marx's lifelong companion, entitled Protectionism and Free Trade, where Marx explains why he advocates and defends the liberalism or neoliberalism of capitalist society. It is a simple and clear exposition without fancy languages and impeccable logic. Written protectionism and free trade is intentionally set aside, ignored by Marxists, defenders of petty bourgeoisie and lumpenproletariat. Almost all of these defenders of these classes are academic socialists, who defend these two reactionary classes. The reason of the Marxists leads them to confuse, to identify capitalism with big capital. They believe they place themselves above the social classes, when in reality they belong to one of the most retrograde, the petty bourgeoisie or the lumpenproletariat. The yellow and bold underlines are added by me to underline what is most important for a better understanding of what capital is. Ercat. Protectionism and Free Trade. At the end of 1847 a Congress of Free Traders was held in Brussels. It was a strategic maneuver within the campaign of free trade that at that time maintained the English industrialists. Victorious in their country, thanks to the repeal of the cereal laws in 1846, they decided to move to the continent and maintain there the demand that English industrial products be granted free access to continental markets, in exchange for allowing the free importation of wheat from the continent into England. The list of speakers at the Congress included Karl Marx. But, unsurprisingly, the organizers managed to get the Congress to close its sessions without Marx being able to take the floor. Marx was forced to lay out what he had to say about free trade in the Democratic Society of Brussels, an international association of which he was vice president. Since the question of protectionism or free trade is currently on the agenda in North America, it has been considered appropriate to publish an English edition of Marx's speech, and I have been invited to put a few words on it as a prologue. The protectionist system was an artificial means of manufacturing manufacturers, expropriating independent workers, capitalizing on the nation's means of production and life, and forcibly shortening the transition from the old regime to the modern regime of production. Marx, Capital, Volume I, 3, ed. p. 783. That was protectionism when it emerged, in the 17th century, and that remained well into the 19th century. The protectionist system was then the normal policy of all the civilized countries of Western Europe. The only exceptions to this rule were the small German states and the Swiss cantons, and not precisely because they disliked the system, but because they were wary of the possibility of applying it within a territory as small as their own. In the shadow of this tariff protection was born and developed in England, in the last third of the 18th century, the system of large modern industry, of production based on machinery and steam power. And, as if the usual tariff protection had not been enough, came the wars waged against the French Revolution, which helped England secure a monopoly on the new industrial methods. For more than 20 years, English warships were tasked with driving England's industrial competitors away from their respective colonial markets and forcibly opening these markets to English trade. The emancipation of the South American colonies from their European metropolises, the conquest by England of all the important markets belonging until then to France and Holland, and the gradual subjugation of India were turning all these countries into as many customers of English industry. England thus completed the tariff protection practiced within its borders with the system of free trade, imposed on foreigners, wherever possible. And, thanks to this fortunate mixture of the two systems, it found itself at the end of the War of 1815 in possession of the effective monopoly of world trade, at least as far as all the decisive branches of industry were concerned. This monopoly developed and consolidated during the years of subsequent peace. The lead the English had taken during the war grew from year to year. England seemed to be leaving behind, more and more, all their possible rivals. In reality, the export of industrial products in increasing quantities seemed like a matter of life and death for England. Only two obstacles seemed to stand in their way: import bans and protective tariffs from other countries, and tariffs on the import of raw materials and food products into England. Thus became popular in the homeland of John Bull the freedom of trade preached by classical political economy, by the French physiocrats and their English henchmen, Adam Smith and Ricardo. Tariff protection within the country was inoperative for the industrialists who had made all their foreign competitors and whose existence were in retreat. It was fully dependent on the continued expansion of its exports. Indoor tariff protection was only advantageous for producers of food and other raw materials, i.e. agriculture, which, in England at the time, was as valid as saying for those who received the rent of land, for the landed nobility. On the other hand, for industrialists, this tariff protection was directly harmful. When it taxed the import of raw materials, it raised the price of industrial products made from them, and when it weighed on foodstuffs, it made the price of labor more expensive. In both cases, it placed the English industrialist in a position of inferiority with respect to the foreigner. And as the other countries exported to England, mainly, agricultural products and imported from it, almost exclusively, industrial articles, the abolition of the English protective tariffs on cereals and raw materials were already tantamount, indirectly, to inviting the foreigner to repeal or at least reduce his import taxes on English industrial products. After a long and violent struggle, the English industrial capitalists triumphed. At that time, these elements were, in fact, the ruling class of the nation, the class whose leaders identified, momentarily, with national interests. The landed nobility had to capitulate. Tariffs on wheat and raw materials were abolished. The slogan was, now, free trade. The immediate task of the English industrialists and their spokesmen, the political economists, was to spread faith everywhere in the gospel of free trade and thus create a world whose great industrial center was England, around which all other countries were reduced to the role of an industrial district dependent on it. That was the time of the Brussels Congress and Marx's controversial speech. Marx recognizes that protective tariffs can still, in certain circumstances, For example, in Germany at the time, favor industrial capitalists. It shows that free trade is by no means the universal panacea for curing all the ills of the working class, and that, far from it, it can even aggravate these ills. But, all that being evident, it pronounces itself ultimately and in principle in favor of free trade. Free trade is, for him, the normal state of modern capitalist production. Only under free trade can the gigantic productive forces of steam, electricity, and machinery fully develop, and the faster this development is, the sooner and more completely its inevitable consequences will manifest themselves, the splitting of society into two classes, on the one hand the capitalists, on the other the wage workers, here hereditary wealth, their misery bequeathed from parents to children, surplus of supply over demand, inability of the markets to absorb the ever-increasing mass of industrial products, a constantly repeated cycle of prosperity, overproduction, crisis, panic, chronic stagnation and gradual revival of business, which is not, by the way, a sign of lasting improvement, but an indication that a new overproduction and a new crisis are coming, in a word, such a gigantic growth of the social productive forces, that the institutions of society under which they have been set in motion they become unbearable obstacles for them, and there is only one solution, a social transformation that frees the social productive forces from the chains of an outdated social order and emancipates from wage slavery the real producers, who form the great majority of the people. And, free trade being the normal and natural atmosphere for this historical development, the economic environment in which the conditions of this inevitable solution can most quickly occur, Marx declares himself, for this and exclusively for this reason, in favor of free trade. However, the years immediately following the triumph of free trade in England seemed to fulfill even the most unbridled hopes of prosperity. British trade rose to fabulous heights, England's industrial monopoly on the world market seemed to rest on firmer foundations than ever before, new furnaces, new factories were emerging everywhere, new industrial branches were born everywhere. It is true that in 1857 a serious crisis occurred, but it was overcome and the new advances in the whole field of commerce and industry were again put on the order of the day, until in 1866 a new panic broke out, which this time seemed, in effect, to open a new epoch of world economic history. There is no doubt that the unusual rise of England's industry and commerce in the years 1848 to 1866 was due, in large part, to the elimination of protective tariffs on raw materials and food items. But not only to this. Other simultaneous events also contributed powerfully to this. The aforementioned years coincide with the discovery and exploitation of the gold mines of California and Australia, which brought with it a huge increase in the means of change in the world market. These years recorded a general revolution in the means of transport, both those of persons and goods, in the ocean, the displacement of sailing ships by steamships and, on land, throughout the civilized world, the triumph of railways over causeways, which makes the railways the main road and delegates paved roads to secondary means of communication. It is not surprising that, in such propitious circumstances, English industry, moved by steam, spread its dominance at the expense of foreign domestic industries, whose driving force was manual labor. And, faced with this, what were the other countries going to do? Cross your arms and resign yourself to being degraded, thus, to the role of simple agrarian appendages of England, workshop of the universe? The other countries didn't do that, far from it. France had been backing its industry for almost 200 years with a veritable Chinese wall of protective tariffs and import bans, acquiring in the field of all luxury and tasteful goods a superiority that England did not even try to discuss. Switzerland, under a regime of complete free trade, possessed a relatively important industry, which English competition could not even touch. Germany, with far more liberal tariffs than any other major continental country, developed its industry relatively more hastily than England itself. Finally, America had suddenly been pushed by the Civil War of 1861, forced to stick to its own resources, had to face a sudden demand for industrial products of all kinds, and could only do so by creating an internal industry of its own. The demand for war ceased at the end of this one, but the new industry was there and had to fight the competition of the English. And the war had matured in the United States the awareness that a people of 35 million, capable of doubling its census of population in 40 years at most, endowed with almost unlimited auxiliary sources and of all kinds and surrounded by neighbors who, for years, would remain essentially attached to agriculture, that this people had the manifest destiny of becoming independent of foreign industries in terms of their articles of main consumption, both in peace and in war. And that's how the United States implemented the protective tariffs. About 15 years ago I traveled in the same train carriage with a clever Glasgow businessman, who was particularly interested in iron. The conversation fell on America. My traveling companion brought up the well-known free trade clichés. Was it not inconceivable, he told me, that business people as skilled as the Americans would pay a tribute to the owners of their blast furnaces and their industrialists, when for the same price they could receive from England the same or better items? And then came the examples of how Americans imposed fabulously tall gabilas on themselves for the sole purpose of enriching 2 or 3 greedy blast furnace owners. However, I intervened, the thing can also be seen on the other hand. As you know, in terms of coal, hydropower, iron, and other mineral deposits, cheap foodstuffs and other raw materials, the United States has resources and advantages that have nothing to envy of any European country and that can only be fully developed when North America is an industrial country. You will also recognize that a great pueblo such as the American one will not devote itself eternally to agriculture as its only occupation, for that would be to condemn it to eternal barbarism and perpetual submission. Today, no great people can subsist without an industry of its own. Well, if the United States is to become an industrial country, and there is no doubt that it has every chance to catch up with and, even more, to beat its competitors in this area, it has only 2 paths before it, either to wage, on a free trade basis, say for 50 years, an extraordinarily costly competitive struggle against English industry, which has been 100 years ahead of it, or, resorting to protective tariffs, to eliminate competition from the English for space, let us say, 25 years, with the almost absolute certainty that, after that time, American industry will conquer a place on the open world market. Which of these 2 paths is the shortest and the cheapest? That's what it's all about knowing. If you travel from Glasgow to London, you can take the legally prescribed turtle train, the parliamentary train, paying at the rate of 1 penny a mile and traveling 12 miles an hour, but surely he will not do it, so as not to waste his time, but will take the express train, even if he has to pay 2 pence per mile, in order to travel at 40 miles an hour. Well, Americans prefer to travel with an express ticket, to arrive much earlier at their destination. The Scottish free trader listened to me without replying a word. Since the protectionist system is an artificial means of manufacturing manufacturers, it may not only seem useful and convenient to a semi-developed capitalist class, still in struggle against feudalism, it can also help and boost the ascensional capitalist class in a country like the United States, which has not come to know feudalism, but which is in the stage of development in which it is posed as a necessity and the passage from agriculture to industry. North America, faced with this alternative, opted for protective tariffs. Since that decision, more or less, the 25 years of which I spoke to my travel companion have passed, and, if I am not mistaken, the protectionist system has already yielded, in that country, the fruits that could be expected of it and can be abandoned as superfluous. That's how I think, for a long time. About 2 years ago, I said to an American protectionist, if the United States implements free trade, I am convinced that England will be beaten on the world market within 10 years. The protectionist system is, at best, an endless nut, and you never know when you've come to the end. By protecting one branch of business, we directly or indirectly harm all the others, which is why we must extend protection to them as well. But, in doing so, we harm, in turn, the first protected industry, which will have the right to ask us to compensate it, and this compensation will have an impact once again, above all other branches of business, and will put them in the case of claiming new repairs, and so on ad infinitum. In this regard, the United States gives us a tangible example of how a major industry can be killed by force of protective tariffs. Total imports and exports of states by sea in 1856 amounted to $641,604,850. Of this amount, U.S. ships accounted for 75.2% and for foreigners only 24.8% of the cargo. Already by then the English transatlantic steamers began to displace the North American sailing vessels. Despite this, in 1860, of a total maritime trade estimated at $762,288,550, American ships still transported 66.5% of the cargo. The Civil War came and, as a consequence of it, protective tariffs were implemented for the construction of American ships, and so effective was this tariff protection, that it almost completely eliminated the flag of the United States from navigation on the high seas. In 1887 the total maritime trade of North America amounted to $1,408,502,979. But only 13.8% of the cargo was carried on domestic ships, while foreign vessels carried 86.2% of the country's ships. Freight. The value of the goods transported by American ships were, in 1856, $482,286,274, in 1860, $507,247,757, in 1887, of $194,356,746 alone. 40 years ago, the flag of the United States threatened to wrest from the English the primacy over the ocean. Today, it has almost disappeared. Tariff protection of navigation has ruined navigation and shipbuilding. Another point. Today, the perfected methods of production follow each other so quickly and so suddenly and completely change the nature of entire branches of industry that what was yesterday an equitable protective tariff is now bartered in the opposite. An example of this is in the aforementioned report of the Secretary of the Treasury, p. 19. The improvements introduced during the last years in the wool combing machinery have caused such changes in the so-called stamen thread cloths, that these cloths have displaced, in men's dresses, the ordinary combed wool cloths. These changes have done a considerable damage to our domestic combed cloth textiles, since the tariffs are the same for raw wool of all kinds, while those levied on carded wool up to a value of 80 cents per pound amount to 35 cents per pound and 35% on the value. In contrast, tariffs for wool combed up to a value of 80 cents per pound are only 10 to 24 cents per pound and 35 cents ad valorem. In some cases, the customs tax on carded wool is higher than the value of the finished genre. Therefore, what yesterday was protection of the domestic industry today becomes a premium for the foreign importer, and the Secretary of the Treasury is right to say, we must hope that the textile industry of carded wool will soon stop working within the country, if the tariff rates are not modified. Now, to modify the tariffs you have to fight with the carded wool weavers, who take advantage of the current situation. You have to open a full-fledged campaign to conquer the majority in both chambers, and you have, finally, to change the public opinion of the country, before which the question arises of whether it is worth it. But the worst thing about tariff protection is that it is not so easy to get rid of it. As difficult as it is to implement an equitable customs tariff in all orders, the return to free trade is infinitely more difficult. Circumstances will never come again, which allowed England to carry out the transit in a couple of years. And even in England we see that the struggle dates back to 1823, Huskisson, which did not achieve the first successes until 1842, Peel's tariff, and which was still standing a few years after the repeal of the cereal laws. At the silk industry, the only one that still had to fear foreign competition, began by granting it prolonged tariff protection for a series of years, then granted it in a truly infamous form. The other textile industries came under the force of the manufacturing law that limited the hours of work for women, young people, and children. The silk industry, on the other hand, was favored by considerable exemptions, being allowed to employ child labor and to make youth workers work longer than other industries. That is, the monopoly that the hypocritical free traders abolished in favor of foreign competitors was restored at the expense of the health and lives of the children of the English workers. But it will never again be the case that a country can carry out the transition from tariff protection to free trade in an era where all or almost all branches of its industry are in a position to cope with foreign competition in the open market. The need for this step will prevail long before such a state of affairs can even be expected. This need will be asserted in different branches of commerce and at different times, and from the conflicting interests of these branches of commerce will spring the most edifying parliamentary disputes and intrigues. The machine builder, the engineer, and the shipyard owner will perhaps consider that the customs protection on iron makes their goods more expensive and closes the doors of export to them exclusively. The cotton textile industry will possibly believe that it would be in a position to beat the English percale in the markets of China and India if tariff protection did not raise the price of the strand for the spinner, etc. At the very moment when a national industrial branch conquers the entire internal market, that industrial branch unquestionably needs exports. Under the capitalist system, an industry has to expand or collapse. There is no middle ground. It cannot remain stationary. If it encounters obstacles to its expansion, that is already the beginning of ruin. The progress of mechanical and chemical inventions constantly leaves a mass of human labor idle, while increasing and concentrating capital even more rapidly. In this way, it creates in every stagnant industry an excess of workers and capital, who find no accommodation elsewhere, for the simple reason that the same process develops simultaneously in all other branches of industry. The transition from internal trade to export trade is therefore a matter of life and death for all branches of industry, but before them are confronted the acquired rights and the consecrated interests of others, who, sometimes, find in tariff protection more security or greater profits than in free trade. And thus a long and tenacious struggle is being waged between free traders and protectionists, a struggle whose leadership soon passes from the hands of those directly concerned to the hands of professional politicians, of those in charge of pulling the threads to the traditional political parties, interested not so much in the problem being solved as in keeping it standing as long as possible. Then after a loss, endless time, money, and energy, the way is usually open for a series of compromises in favor of one side or the other, compromises that, together, are slowly promoting free trade, unless, in the meantime, tariff protection manages to make every point unbearable for the nation, as could very well happen in the United States. Of all the types of tariff protection, the worst is the one deployed in Germany. This country also experienced in the wake of the year 1815 the need for rapid industrial development. The first condition for this was to create an internal market by eliminating the innumerable customs lines and tax laws of each of the small states themselves, in a word, by establishing a German customs league. This was only viable on the basis of liberal tariffs, oriented more towards taxation purposes than towards industrial protection. Only under this condition would small states have been moved to join that league. Thus, the league's new customs tariff, although it protected certain industries to a minimal extent, was, when implemented, a true model of free trade, and remains so, although most German industrialists raised their voices, demanding tariff protection. And yet, under the regime of this extraordinarily liberal tariff and in spite of the relentless oppression that for the German domestic industries, based on manual labor, meant the competition of the great English industry also in Germany was carried out, little by little, and has almost come to an end, the passage from manual labor to machinery. And to the same extent Germany's transition from agriculture to industry was operated, a process stimulated, moreover, from 1866, by political events, the establishment of a strong central government and a Reich Parliament, which guaranteed uniform industrial legislation, the introduction of a general currency and the same weights and measures, and, finally, the wave of 1 billion of the French. This explains why, in 1874, the global volume of German trade on the world market was only lower than that of England *, and that Germany employed more steam power in industry and transport than any other continental European country. It was thus demonstrated that even now, despite the enormous lead of English industry, a great country can rise to the level of victorious competition with England. Under these conditions the front suddenly changed. At the very moment when free trade seemed to be a necessity for Germany, Germany implemented protective tariffs. It was, of course, something absurd, but it admits explanation. While Germany exported wheat, all the landowners and all the ship owners were enthusiastic free traders. But, in 1874, instead of exporting cereals, Germany needed to import them in large quantities. Around the same time, North America began to flood Europe with cheap wheat. Wherever this grain went, it reduced the income in money supplied by the land and, consequently, the rent of the land. From then on, the territorial property of all of Europe raised the cry demanding tariff protection. At the same time, German industry suffered the consequences of the rampant overproduction and overspeculation caused by the reign of the millions coming from France, while England, whose industry had not yet managed to overcome the chronic stagnation that occurred after the crisis of 1866, flooded all the markets to it affordable with the unsellable goods of borders inside, and that for that reason threw the malbarato abroad. Therefore, although the German industry was essentially on exports, industrialists now saw protective tariffs as a means of exclusively securing the internal market. However, the government, for its part, was very pleased to be able to take advantage of this circumstance for the benefit of the landed nobility, granting protective tariffs to both sectors, the landowners and the industrialists. In 1878 a high protective tariff was imposed, which applied to both agricultural and industrial products. This resulted in the export of Germany's industrial products being directly subsidized by the pockets of the domestic consumer. As many cases as possible, the industrialists formed cartels to regulate foreign trade and production itself. German steel production is in the hands of a few companies, mostly joint stock companies, which together produce about 4 times more iron than the country needs on average. To avoid sterile mutual competition, these companies have formed a consortium, in charge of distributing among them all foreign orders and of indicating in each case the company called to make the real offer. A few years ago, this consortium had even reached an agreement with the English owners of blast furnaces, an agreement that, however, came by land. The coal mines of Westphalia, which produce around 30 million tons a year, have also formed a cartel to regulate the prices of tenders and production itself. In general, every German industrialist claims that the sole purpose of tariff protection is to enable it to compensate the domestic market for the ruinous prices it has to accept abroad. But that's not all. At the cost of this absurd system of industrial protection, the industrial capitalists have accepted an even more absurd monopoly, which has kept territorial ownership standing. Not only do they impose high import tariffs on agricultural products, which are also increased incessantly, but certain rural industries exploited on their farms by the landowners are directly subsidized by the treasury. The beet sugar industry, in addition to being protected, receives huge sums in the form of export premiums. Someone who has reason to know believes that if all the sugar that is exported were thrown into the sea, manufacturers would still do a good deal with the export premium. Similarly, potato spirit distillers receive, thanks to the new legislation, a gift of no less than 36 million marks per year, which come out of the taxpayers' pockets. And, as almost all the big landowners in northeastern Germany are beet sugar manufacturers or potato brandy distillers, or both, it is not surprising that the world is flooded with their products. This policy, which would be ruinous in any situation, is doubly so for a country whose industry finds its way out in neutral markets thanks, mainly, to the cheapness of work. Even in the best of times, wages paid in Germany remain intolerably close to the level of hunger, thanks to the rapid increase in the population census, despite the high rate of immigration. But the shortage of all food, imposed by the protective tariffs, pressures the rise in wages. At that point, the German industrialist will no longer be in a position, as is all too often the case today, to recover from the ruinous prices of his commodities by deducting from the normal wages of his workers, and will lose his capacity for competition. In Germany, protective tariffs kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. France also suffers the consequences of tariff protection. Here, the protectionist system, by dint of ruling without discussion for 200 years, has become almost an integral part of the life of the nation. However, it is a growing drag. Big industry constantly imposes changes in production methods, but protective tariffs get in the way. The lining of silk velvet is currently made of fine cotton strand. Well, the French manufacturer has to pay the customs tax for this kind or, if it does not, undergo endless bureaucratic formalities and hassles which counteract and cancel in practice the temporary admission granted, and thus explains why the Krefeld manufacturers can compete effectively, because in that place it is still under the customs tariff on the fine strand of cotton. French exports, as we have already said, consist mainly of luxury goods, in which the French taste decides, which until now is in the lead, but the main consumers of these items are, today, everywhere, the modern careerists of capitalism, devoid of culture and good taste, who are content with crude and cheap German or English imitations and who, all too often, buy these imitated items at fabulous prices, believing them to be legitimate French. The market for special items that cannot be manufactured outside France is becoming increasingly restricted. The export of French industrial products is barely defended and cannot take long to fall, because what new items can France export, replacing those whose export is disappearing? The only thing that can save or remedy the situation, in France, is the bold move to the free trade regime, which takes French industrialists out of the greenhouse atmosphere to which they are accustomed and forces them to breathe in the open air from open competition. The truth is that all French trade would have collapsed already if it had not underpinned it from the weak and insecure step towards free trade represented by the Cobden Treaty in 1860-46, but its effects, at this point, have almost vanished, and it is necessary to give the country a stronger dose of this tonic. Russia is hardly worth talking about. In this country, the protective customs tariff, the tariffs of which must be paid in gold, and not in depreciated national currency, serves above all to supply the destitute government with hard cash which, unfortunately for it, it cannot do without in its relations with foreign creditors. The day on which this tariff fulfills the protective function assigned to it and closes the passage to all foreign goods without exception, that day will bankrupt the Russian government. However, this same government makes its gullible subjects conceive the bright hope that the protective tariffs will turn Russia into a totally independent country, which does not need to import absolutely anything from abroad, neither food nor raw materials nor products of industry or art. The people who believe blindly in this spectral Russia, isolated from the whole world, are quite similar to that Prussian lieutenant of the guard who asked on earth for a globe, but not of the entire planet, but only of Prussia. But back to North America. There is already enough evidence to conclude that the protectionist system he has given the United States all it could give and that it is time to say goodbye to him. One of these indications to which we refer is the creation of cartels to support the protected industry in the exploitation of its monopoly. Now, cartels, trusts and consortia, are typically American institutions, and when they are created to exploit natural advantages they must be endured momentarily. The transformation of Pennsylvania's mineral oil production into a monopoly of the Standard Oil Company is a procedure perfectly in keeping with the rules of capitalist production. But it would not be the same, far from it, if the sugar manufacturers tried to turn into a monopoly against national consumers, that is, against the same nation that grants them the protective tariffs, the protection that the nation grants them. However, the big sugar manufacturers have, in effect, created a cartel which pursues no other purpose. And the sugar cartel isn't the only one of its kind. The creation of cartels of this kind in protected industries is the surest indication that tariff protection no longer has a raison d'etre and has changed in character, which no longer protects the industrialist against the foreign importer, but against the national consumer, that, in this branch at least, protectionism has already manufactured enough manufacturers, and it is even possible that more than the account, that the money that tariff protection gives to these manufacturers is money thrown on the street, neither more nor less than in Germany. Unlike elsewhere, tariff protection is advocated in the United States on the grounds that free trade only favors England. But the best proof that this is not the case is in the fact that, in England, not only tenants and landlords become protectionists, but even industrialists. On November 19, 1886, the Chamber of Commerce discussed, in full headquarters of the Manchester Free Trade School, in Manchester itself, the proposal that after having waited for 40 years in vain for other nations to decide to follow the free trade example of England, the House believes the time has come to reconsider the situation. The proposal was rejected, it is true, but it achieved 21 votes to 22. And this was happening at the center of the cotton industry, the only English industry whose superiority continues to assert itself on the open market. Of course, also in this specific industrial branch we see that the spirit of inventiveness has migrated from England to the United States. Almost all the new improvements in machinery for the cotton industry, spinning and textiles, have come out of North America, and Manchester has limited itself to adopting them. The United States is resolutely leading the way in industrial inventions of all kinds, while Germany is vying for second place for the English. In England, the conviction that the English industrial monopoly has inevitably passed into history, that, proportionally, England loses more and more ground as its competitors advance, and that a situation is gradually approaching in which it will have to resign itself to being an industrial country among many, is gaining ground. Instead of becoming, as he had dreamed, the workshop of the world. And, to try to contain this inevitable fate, tariff protection is now invoked, wrapped under the veil of fair trade and combat tariffs, and invoked by the children of the same men who some 40 years ago saw no salvation other than complete and absolute free trade. And, if we see that, now, the English industrialists themselves believe that free trade ruins them and implores the government to protect them against foreign competition, there is no doubt that the time has come to throw overboard the protectionist system, already completely useless, and to combat the industrial monopoly of England. In a shipwrecked trance, with his own weapon, with free trade. However, as we have seen, it is easier to implement tariff protection than to get rid of it. Legislation, by adopting protective tariffs, creates powerful interests and strives for them. And not all these interests or all these industrial branches are equally in a position to expose themselves, at any given time, to free competition. Some no longer need protectionist walkers, but others are dragging themselves laboriously, stumbling. This difference of situation will trigger in Parliament the usual debates between the parties and constitutes in itself sufficient guarantee that, when free trade is definitively shelved, the industries will be protected delicately and cleanly, as was done after 1846 with the silk industry in England. As things stand, it is inevitable and free traders will have to resign themselves to it, as long as the transition is maintained only in principle. The question of free trade or tariff protection remains entirely within the frameworks of the current system of capitalist production, and therefore offers no direct interest to the socialists, who demand the abolition of this system. But it interests them indirectly, since they are interested in the present system of production developing as freely as possible and spreading as quickly as possible, since in this way it will also unfold its inevitable economic consequences, the misery of the great masses of the people, as a result of overproduction, the source of periodic crises or chronic stagnation of the market, the splitting of society into two camps, a small class of big capitalists and a large class of people who are, in fact, wage slaves from parents to children, etc., proletarians, whose number is constantly increasing, while they are being deprived, also incessantly, of work by the work of the new machinery, by means of which labor is saved, in a word, the stagnation of society in a dead end, that is, with a single way out, the total transformation of the economic structure that serves as the basis for society. Staying in this position, Marx advocated, 40 years ago, in principle, in favor of free trade, considering it as the most right path, that is, the one that will most soon bring capitalist society out of this quagmire. Now, does the fact that Marx is, for this reason, a supporter of free trade not fully justify the fact that all the supporters of the present order are against him? If free trade has a revolutionary mission, isn't it natural for all good citizens to vote for the protectionist system, in contrast to the necessarily conservative one? If a country, today, embraces free trade, it will not, of course, do so in gratitude to the communists, but because free trade constitutes, under current conditions, a necessity for industrial capitalists. And if it rejects it and clings to the protective tariffs so as not to please the socialists and to hide from them the expected social catastrophe, the only one that will be harmed by it will be the country itself. Protectionism is a means of artificially manufacturing manufacturers, but it is also, for that very reason, a means of artificially manufacturing wage workers. Whoever raises the one has no choice but to raise the others. The salaried worker follows the manufacturer everywhere, on his heels. It is like the black shadow of which Horace speaks, which marches behind the rider and that he cannot shake, whatever he does. You will not be able to escape fate or, in other words, the necessary consequences of your own actions. A system of production based on the exploitation of wage labor, a system in it that wealth increases in proportion to the number of employed and exploited workers, can subsist only by increasing the class of wage workers and thereby accentuating a class antagonism, against which, inevitably, the whole system will crash one day, sinking. There is no remedy. You cannot but promote and develop the capitalist system, accelerate the accumulation and centralization of capital and, at the same time, increase the production of a class that is on the margins of official society. And the fact that you follow the path of protectionism or embrace that of free trade, will not change the result in the slightest and, in addition, will extend very little the period you have until the time of the outcome. Long before that time, tariff protection will have become an unbearable shackle for any country that aspires, with prospects of success, to occupy an independent position in the world market. Forward to the American edition of the pamphlet entitled Karl Marx, Discourse on the Problem of Free Trade, New York, 1888. Translated from the German version of F. Engels, Die Neuzeit, Year 6, 1888, pages 289 to 299.